Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Gideon Hayes thought his story was over, a lonely mountain man with nothing but regrets and old scars. Then he wins an old estate in a poker game and finds something he never expected. Diana, a young woman who has survived alone in the wilderness for years. She's not wild or broken, just strong in ways most people never have to be. Two lost souls, trapped by a brutal winter, slowly learning to trust again. The cabin becomes more than shelter. It becomes hope. But what secret about the estate will change everything they thought they knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound journal sat heavy in Gideon Hayes's weathered hands as he traced the faded cover with calloused fingers. 63 years of living had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes, and every page within held fragments of a life lived hard among the unforgiving peaks of the Montana wilderness. He'd been writing in it for 30 years, documenting everything from weather patterns to philosophical musings about the nature of solitude. 3 months had passed since that night in Copper Creek's only saloon, when fate had dealt him a hand that changed everything. The memory still felt surreal. 5 worn playing cards, a pot worth more than he'd seen in a decade, and an estate deed that felt like a piece of fiction in his rough hands. He'd been nursing his 3rd whiskey when old Patterson had thrown the property deed into the center of the table, claiming it was worth more than the cash he owed. Remote cabin up near Blackwater Ridge, Patterson had slurred, his breath reeking of desperation and cheap alcohol. Been in my family 40 years. Good hunting land, maybe some mineral rights. Take it or leave it. Gideon had studied his cards, a full house, kings over 8s, and felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope. Or maybe just the whiskey. Either way, he'd called the bet and watched Patterson's face crumble as he laid down his losing hand. The deed had passed across the scarred wooden table like a message from another life. Now, as February wind howled through the pines around his own modest cabin, Gideon packed his few possessions with the methodical care of a man who'd learned to travel light. The journal went into his saddlebags first, wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from the elements. Then came his grandfather's rifle, the one that had seen him through 30 years of mountain living, its stock worn smooth by generations of Hayes men. His decision to claim the estate hadn't been immediate. For weeks, he'd stared at the deed while winter deepened around his cabin, wondering if a man his age had any business chasing after property he'd won in a card game. But as the walls seemed to close in, and the silence grew heavier with each passing day, he'd realized he had nothing left to lose. His last neighbor had moved to town 2 years ago. The woman he'd once thought he might marry had passed the previous spring. Even his old dog had died, leaving Gideon with nothing but memories, and the growing certainty that he was becoming a ghost in his own life. The journey to Blackwater Ridge took him 3 days, through some of the most brutal terrain Montana had to offer. He rode his sturdy mare, Belle, while leading a pack horse loaded with supplies, enough food and gear to last through the remainder of winter, assuming the cabin was habitable. The deed described the property as rustic but sound, which in Gideon's experience could mean anything from needs a new roof to pile of rotting lumber. On the 2nd day, he encountered a trapper heading down from the high country who warned him about the weather moving in from the west. "Big storm coming," the man had said, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "Might want to hole up somewhere for a few days when it hits." Gideon had thanked him and pressed on. He'd weathered countless storms in his lifetime and had learned to read the signs in the sky, the behavior of animals, the way the wind shifted and carried the scent of snow. This one would be fierce, but he'd faced worse. By the 3rd morning, he could see smoke. The thin grey column rose from somewhere ahead, barely visible against the overcast sky. Gideon reined in Belle and studied the landscape before him. According to the deed, his property lay just beyond the next ridge, in a small valley that had once supported a logging operation. The smoke could mean anything: hunters, travelers, or squatters who'd found shelter in what they assumed was an abandoned cabin. As he crested the ridge, the full scope of his inheritance spread out below him. The cabin sat in a natural clearing beside a frozen creek, larger than he'd expected, and clearly well-maintained. Smoke rose steadily from the stone chimney, and he could see fresh-cut wood stacked neatly against the south wall. Someone had been living here, and they'd been doing it with care and intelligence. Gideon's first instinct was anger. He'd traveled 3 days through brutal cold to claim property that was rightfully his, only to find it occupied by some squatter who'd probably been living rent-free for months. But as he studied the scene more carefully, his irritation gave way to curiosity. The person below had clearly put real work into maintaining the place. The roof looked solid, the windows were intact, and the surrounding area showed signs of thoughtful stewardship rather than careless occupation. He urged Bell down the slope, his grandfather's rifle within easy reach but not drawn. As they approached the cabin, he noticed other details that spoke of long-term habitation. A small garden plot, dormant now but carefully tended. Animal tracks leading to and from what looked like snare lines. Someone wasn't just squatting here, they were homesteading. The cabin door opened before he reached the hitching post. She stood in the doorway like something from another century, wrapped in a patchwork coat that had seen better years but was clearly well cared for. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her brown eyes held the kind of steady wariness that came from living alone in dangerous country. She couldn't have been more than 25, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of hard-won maturity. "You lost, mister." Her voice carried no fear, only the cautious politeness of someone prepared for trouble, but hoping to avoid it. Gideon dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Name's Gideon Hayes. I believe I own this property." She didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show any of the shock he'd expected. Instead, she studied him with the same careful attention he'd seen in experienced hunters, sizing up unfamiliar game. "You have papers to prove that?" He reached into his coat and withdrew the deed, unfolding it carefully. She stepped forward, not close enough for him to grab her, but near enough to read the document. Her eyes moved across the legal language with the quick comprehension of someone who could read well. Another surprise in this collection of unexpected discoveries. "This deed's dated 3 months ago," she said finally. "Won it in a poker game in Copper Creek from a man named Patterson. Something shifted in her expression at the name, a tightening around her eyes that spoke of recognition and perhaps old pain. Patterson. She spoke the name like it left a bad taste. "Haven't heard that name in a while. You know him." "I know of him." She handed the deed back. "I suppose you'll be wanting me gone then." The matter-of-fact way she said it caught him off guard. No pleading, no anger, no attempt to negotiate. Just quiet acceptance of what seemed to her an inevitable conclusion. "Where would you go?" The question came out before he'd fully formed the thought. She shrugged, a gesture that tried to convey indifference, but didn't quite hide the deeper concern underneath. "Somewhere else. Always somewhere else for folks like me. Folks like you. Folks without papers. Without claims. Without family to speak for them." Gideon looked past her into the cabin, where he could see the glow of a well-tended fire and the neat organization of someone who'd made a real home from basic materials. The storm the trapper had warned him about was building in the western sky, dark clouds pregnant with snow that would make travel impossible for days. "Storm coming," he said. "I know. Big one, by the look of it. Might be we should discuss this inside. After it passes." She studied him for a long moment, taking his measure the way a person learned to do when their survival depended on reading strangers correctly. Whatever she saw in his weathered face and steady grey eyes must have satisfied her, because she stepped aside. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Such as it is." Gideon tied Bell and the pack-horse to the hitching post and unloaded his immediate supplies. As he worked, he could feel her watching him, cataloguing his movements and equipment with the sharp attention of someone for whom observation meant the difference between safety and danger. The coffee, When she poured it was bitter but hot, made from grounds that had clearly been stretched to last as long as possible. She handed him the cup without ceremony and settled into a chair across from the small wooden table that dominated the cabin's main room. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 2 years, give or take. Alone. Now I am. The simple answer carried weight that spoke of loss and abandonment, though she offered no details and he didn't press. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Diana rose from her chair and moved to the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She studied the snowflakes with the focused attention of someone whose life depended on reading weather patterns correctly. Near her feet lay a collection of handmade snare traps, their wire loops and wooden triggers speaking of countless hours of careful craftsmanship and field testing. "This storm's going to last 3 days," she said without turning around. "Maybe 4. Gideon set down his coffee cup and followed her gaze. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that caught what little light remained in the afternoon sky. He'd seen enough Montana winters to recognize the signs of a serious blow, the particular weight of the clouds, the way the wind had suddenly stilled. The eager way the snow was already beginning to accumulate. "You seem certain about that. I've had plenty of time to learn the patterns up here." She turned from the window and gestured toward the snares. "These mountains don't forgive mistakes in judgment." Gideon examined the traps more closely. They were ingeniously designed, each one crafted to target specific animals with minimal waste of materials. The triggers were sensitive enough to catch rabbits, but strong enough to hold larger game. Someone had taught her well, or she'd learned through hard necessity. "Who showed you how to make these?" "My grandfather before he died. Rest I figured out myself." She picked up one of the snares and tested its mechanism with practiced fingers. "You learn fast when it's learn or starve. Your family lived up here?" Diana's hands stilled on the trap. For a moment Gideon thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to guard painful memories. "My family lived a lot of places, never anywhere long enough to call it home." She set the snare back down. 2 years ago I was traveling with a group heading west. Traders, they called themselves, though I had my doubts about some of their business. We got caught in an early blizzard, and they decided to winter here. And then, come spring, they decided I was more trouble than I was worth. "Too many mouths to feed," they said. Left me with a bag of salt pork and a promise they'd send help when they reached the next town. Gideon felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "They abandoned you?" "People do what they have to do to survive." Diana's tone remained matter-of-fact, but Gideon caught the flash of old hurt in her eyes. "I made my choice to trust them. They made their choice to leave me behind. You were alone here for 2 winters. Not alone exactly. These mountains are full of life, if you know how to look for it. And I had the cabin to keep me warm, the creek for water. I learned to set snares, to identify which plants were safe to eat, which roots would keep through winter storage." She moved to a wooden crate near the fireplace and lifted the lid, revealing rows of dried berries, preserved meat, and carefully wrapped bundles of roots and herbs. "I learned to be sufficient." Gideon studied her supplies with growing respect. This wasn't the desperate hoarding of someone barely surviving. It was the methodical preparation of someone who'd mastered their environment. Every item was properly preserved, efficiently stored and organized for easy access. She'd done more than survive. She'd created a sustainable life. "The property deed I have, it's legal and binding," he said carefully. "But I'm curious about something. The man who lost this place to me, Patterson, seemed to know more about it than he let on. You said you recognized the name." Diana's expression hardened. "Patterson was here last fall. Came through with 2 other men, said they were surveying for the territorial government. Asked a lot of questions about the land, the water rights, whether I'd seen any mineral deposits or unusual rock formations." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful. I don't trust men who come asking questions with no good reason to give them answers." She moved to the fireplace and stirred the coals, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "He seemed particularly interested in the old mine shaft up the ridge. There's a mine on this property?" Abandoned silver mine from the 1870s, played out years ago, according to the territorial records. Though Patterson seemed to think it might be worth another look, Gideon absorbed this information while watching Diana tend the fire. She moved with the economical grace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy and avoid wasted motion. Every gesture served a purpose. Every action contributed to the business of staying alive and comfortable. You've read the territorial records. I can read, Mr. Hayes, and I've had 2 years with nothing but time to educate myself about this land and its history. There's a whole shelf of books here that the previous occupants left behind. She gestured toward a rough bookshelf built into the wall near the window. Survey records, geological studies, local history. I've read them all twice. The more she revealed about herself, the more Gideon realized how dramatically he'd underestimated the situation. This wasn't a simple case of a squatter who needed to be moved along. Diana had established herself here through intelligence, determination, and genuine connection to the land. She'd become part of this place in ways that no legal document could capture. The people who abandoned you, he said. Did they know about the mine? They knew. That's why they chose this spot to winter. They spent weeks exploring that shaft, coming back with rock samples and making notes in a ledger they kept locked away. Diana's voice carried a note of old anger. When they left in spring, they took that ledger with them, but not you. I was never part of their business arrangements. I was just a young woman who'd paid for passage west and had nowhere else to go when they decided I was inconvenient. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up, driving the snow horizontally past the windows. Gideon could hear it whistling through the gaps in the cabin's chinking. Despite Diana's obvious efforts to seal every opening, against the cold, this storm's going to strand us here together for several days, he said. I know. We should probably establish some ground rules. Diana turned from the fire to face him directly. In the flickering light, her dark eyes held a mixture of wariness and resignation that spoke of too many disappointments and too few pleasant surprises. You're the legal owner, she said. Your rules. That's not what I meant. Gideon rose from his chair and moved to the window, watching the snow pile up against the glass. I meant rules for getting through this storm without killing each other. Practical things like who sleeps where, who handles what chores, how we share the food and fuel. I sleep in the loft. You can have the main room by the fire. I'll handle my own meals and pull my own weight with the firewood and water. Her tone was carefully neutral. When the storm passes, I'll pack what's mine and move on. What if you didn't have to? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Diana stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. What do you mean? I mean, this is a big property, and it's clear you know how to take care of it. Maybe we could work something out. What kind of arrangement? Gideon turned away from the window to meet her gaze. I don't know yet. But I do know that turning you out into this storm would be the action of a man I don't want to be. Diana studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given his deed and his equipment. Outside, the storm was building toward the full fury the weather patterns had promised. And both of them knew that whatever decisions they made in the next few hours would determine far more than simply how they weathered the coming blizzard. The first night passed in careful silence, broken only by the howling wind and the steady crackle of the fire. Gideon had made his bed on the floor near the hearth, while Diana retreated to the loft above, the ladder creaking softly under her weight. He'd caught a glimpse of a small, neat space up there, a mattress made from sewn-together grain sacks, blankets that had been mended multiple times, and a wooden crate that served as both table and storage, tucked beneath her pillow. He'd noticed the corner of something that looked like a photograph, though she'd turned away too quickly for him to see more. Morning brought 18 inches of fresh snow, and the realization that Diana's weather prediction had been conservative. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the cabin's shutters and send occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. Diana climbed down from the loft before dawn, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to starting days in darkness. She wore the same patched coat from the day before, but underneath he could see she'd layered herself with wool sweaters and practical canvas pants that had been tailored for her smaller frame. "Coffee?" she asked, though she was already moving toward the stove. "I'd be grateful." She worked without speaking, stoking the fire and setting water to boil with movements that spoke of long practice. Gideon watched her navigate the small space, noting how she'd organized everything for maximum efficiency. Tools hung from pegs driven into the walls. Food supplies were stored in sealed containers to keep out mice. Even her few personal belongings had designated places that kept them accessible but out of the way. "You've made this place into a real home," he said. Diana glanced up from the coffee pot. "I've made it livable. There's a difference, is there?" She considered the question while measuring grounds into the pot. "A home is something you build with other people. This is just a place where I've learned to survive alone." Gideon felt the weight of that distinction. He thought about his own cabin, abandoned now for this journey, and realized it fell into the same category as Diana's refuge, a place of solitary survival rather than shared belonging. "The photograph in your loft," he said carefully. "Family?" Diana's hands stilled on the coffee pot. For a moment he thought she'd refuse to answer, but then she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small, water-damaged photograph. She set it on the table between them without explanation. The image showed a younger Diana, perhaps 15 or 16, standing between an older man and woman in front of a simple farmhouse. All three were smiling, and Diana's face held a lightness that was completely absent from the woman he'd met yesterday. The photograph had been kept with obvious care, despite the damage around its edges. "My grandparents," she said, "raised me after my parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 8. They looked like good people. They were. Taught me everything useful I know about living off the land, reading weather, understanding what the mountains could provide and what they'd take from you if you weren't careful." Diana traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "They died within 6 months of each other when I turned 18. Farm got sold to pay debts. That's when I started traveling west, looking for somewhere I could use what they'd taught me. And you ended up with those traders. I ended up trusting people I should have been more careful about." She tucked the photograph back into her pocket. "Won't make that mistake again." Gideon heard the warning in her words and respected it. Trust, once broken, took time and proof to rebuild. He poured himself coffee and settled back in his chair, content to let the conversation find its own pace. "Your grandfather's rifle," Diana said, nodding toward where he'd propped the weapon near the door. "Military issue? Spanish-American War. He carried it in Cuba, then brought it home and used it to feed his family for 30 years. Passed it to my father, who passed it to me. You serve. Some, nothing as dramatic as Cuba. Mostly kept the peace in mining towns and railroad camps." Gideon sipped his coffee and studied Diana's face. "You know weapons. Enough. My grandfather made sure I could handle myself with rifle and pistol both. Said a woman alone needed to be able to protect what was hers. Smart man. He was. Right about most things, including people." Diana moved to the window and checked the storm's progress. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. We should check the animals and make sure we have enough firewood staged close to the cabin." Gideon followed her outside into the driving snow. The cold hit like a physical blow, and he had to admire Diana's practical assessment of their situation. She led him to a lean-to shelter behind the cabin where she'd built windbreaks for the animals and stored several cords of split wood within easy carrying distance of the door. "You planned for this," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "I plan for everything I can think of. The mountains don't give you second chances for poor preparation. They work together to secure loose items and move additional firewood closer to the cabin." Diana demonstrated a knowledge of storm management that impressed him. She knew how to read wind patterns, to predict where snow would drift, how to protect the animals from the worst of the weather, and how to conserve fuel while maintaining adequate heat. "Where'd you learn all this?" he asked as they stacked wood under the eaves. "Trial and error, mostly. Lost a lot of firewood to poor storage my first winter. Nearly froze to death before I figured out how to manage the drafts in this cabin." She paused in her work to study the sky. Also had help from some of the local trappers. They'd stop by occasionally, share information about weather patterns and survival techniques. Local trappers still come around. Not so much anymore. Last few months, they've been avoiding this area. Something spooked them, though none of them would say what. Gideon filed that information away as they finished their preparations and returned to the cabin's warmth. As Diana rebuilt the fire, he found himself studying her with growing respect. She moved through these tasks with the confidence of someone who'd mastered her environment through necessity and intelligence rather than luck or outside help. "Diana," he said as she hung her coat on its peg, "about our arrangement while we're stormbound, I want you to know I'm not expecting anything from you beyond basic courtesy and cooperation." She turned to look at him directly. "I appreciate you saying that clearly, and when this storm passes, we'll figure out something fair regarding the property. I didn't come here to turn anyone out of their home. This isn't my home, Mr. Hayes. It's your property, and I'm just someone who's been living on it without permission. Maybe we need to reconsider what makes a place home." Diana studied his face for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his words against her experience of broken promises and abandoned trust. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, binding them together in this small space where two damaged people would either learn to coexist or destroy whatever peace each had managed to find. By the second day, the storm had settled into a relentless rhythm that made the outside world seem like a distant memory. Snow continued to fall steadily, and the wind carved deep drifts against the cabin's north wall. Inside, Gideon and Diana had developed their own rhythm of shared tasks and careful coexistence. Diana prepared their meals with ingredients from her carefully managed stores, while Gideon maintained the fire and handled the heavier work of bringing in wood and water. They moved around each other in the small space with surprising grace, each instinctively respecting the other's need for personal territory while cooperating on essential tasks. It was while Diana was preparing a stew from preserved vegetables and dried meat that Gideon noticed the small leather pouch she wore on a cord around her neck. When she leaned forward to stir the pot, something metallic caught the firelight from within the pouch. "Military tags?" he asked quietly. Diana's hand moved instinctively to the pouch, a protective gesture that spoke of long habit. "Something like that." Gideon didn't press, but as the day wore on, he found himself sharing fragments of his own history in ways that might encourage similar openness from her. While they ate their simple but satisfying meal, he told her about his years spent keeping peace in rough mining camps, about the men he'd served with and the violence he'd witnessed. "The thing about military service," he said, watching steam rise from his coffee cup, "is that it teaches you to recognize the same experience in other people. There's a way veterans carry themselves, a particular kind of alertness that comes from living in dangerous places." Diana set down her spoon and studied his face. "You think I'm a veteran? I think you've seen violence and learned to be prepared for it. The question is whether it was military violence or some other kind." For a long moment she didn't respond. Then slowly she reached into the leather pouch and withdrew 2 military identification tags. They were worn smooth from handling and bearing, stamped with a name that wasn't hers. "Thomas Michael Chen," she read from the tags. "Private, United States Army. These belong to my brother." Gideon accepted the tags when she offered them, feeling their weight and the warmth they'd absorbed from being carried close to her heart. "Your brother was a soldier?" "For 3 years. Served in the Philippines during the uprising. Came home changed in ways that none of us understood." Diana's voice carried the careful control of someone speaking about profound loss. The war had gotten into his head somehow. He'd wake up screaming, couldn't bear loud noises, jumped at shadows that weren't there. Shell shock. I've seen it in other men. We didn't know what to call it then. We just knew Thomas wasn't the same person who'd left for the war. Diana took the tags back and held them in her cupped palms. He tried to settle back into farm life, but the quiet seemed to make it worse somehow. Said he needed to keep moving, needed to find someplace where the war couldn't follow him, so he headed west. We all did. Thomas, me, and our grandparents. Thought maybe a fresh start in new country would help him find peace. Diana returned the tags to their pouch. But the war traveled with him no matter how far we went. One morning, about 6 months into our journey, we woke up and found he'd taken his rifle and walked out into the wilderness. Never came back. Gideon felt the weight of that revelation settle between them. He understood now why Diana carried herself with such watchful readiness, why she'd learned to survive alone, why trust came so hard for her. Your grandparents must have been devastated. Losing Thomas broke something in them that never healed. They died within the year, and suddenly I was alone, with nothing but what I could carry, and the knowledge they'd taught me about surviving in hard country. Diana stared into the fire. That's when I fell in with those traitors. I was grieving and scared and willing to trust anyone who offered security, and they abandoned you here. They saw an opportunity to winter somewhere comfortable and used me to justify stopping. When spring came and they were ready to move on, I'd become inconvenient baggage. Diana's voice carried no self-pity, only the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. I've been carrying Thomas's tags ever since, trying to understand what he was looking for when he walked away from us. Gideon stared at the fire, processing this new understanding of the woman across from him. She wasn't just a survivor. She was someone who'd lost everyone she'd ever loved to war, death, and abandonment. The fact that she'd managed to build any kind of life for herself in this isolated place spoke to a strength of character that demanded respect. You think he found peace? Gideon asked. I hope so. I'd like to think he found some quiet place where the war couldn't reach him anymore. Diana rose from her chair and moved to the window, checking the storm's progress. Sometimes I wonder if that's what I'm really doing here, looking for the same kind of peace he was searching for. And have you found it? Some days, when the work is good and the mountains are quiet and I can go whole hours without thinking about everything I've lost. She turned back toward him. What about you, Mr. Hayes? What brought you to that poker game where you won this place? Gideon considered the question, recognizing it as a fair exchange for the personal history she'd just shared. Same thing that brought your brother west, I suppose. Looking for some place where the past can't follow so easily. What past are you running from? 30 years of watching other people build families and communities, while I convinced myself I preferred solitude. 30 years of choosing safe distance over the risk of getting hurt again. Gideon met her eyes. I came here because I was tired of being alone with my regrets. Diana studied his face in the firelight, and he could see her weighing his words against her own experience of loss and isolation. Solitude's safer, she said finally. But it's not the same thing as peace. No, Gideon agreed. It's not. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the cabin, something had shifted between them. The careful politeness of strangers had given way to the tentative recognition of two people who'd each paid hard prices for their survival and might, perhaps, be ready to consider what it would mean to stop running from their respective pasts. The third morning brought the first hint of clearing skies, though the wind still drove snow across the landscape in shifting patterns that spoke of winter's reluctance to release its grip. Diana woke to find Gideon already tending the fire, moving quietly to avoid disturbing her sleep. He'd proven himself considerate in the small ways that mattered when two people shared limited space. He kept his belongings organized, helped with meals without being asked, and respected her need for privacy while remaining genuinely companionable. After breakfast, she led him to a wooden crate near the back wall of the cabin and lifted the lid to reveal something unexpected, a hand-carved chess set. The pieces worn smooth from handling and stained dark with age and careful use. My grandfather carved these during the winter. I turned 12, she said, running her fingers over the knight's mane. Said a person needed something to occupy their mind during the long months when outdoor work wasn't possible. Gideon examined the craftsmanship with obvious appreciation. Each piece had been carved with remarkable detail. The king wore a crown of tiny wooden leaves, the queen's robes flowed in graceful folds, and the pawns stood at attention like tiny soldiers. The board itself was a marvel of inlay work. Alternating squares of light and dark wood fitted together with perfect precision. He was an artist, Gideon said. He was a man who understood that surviving winter required more than just staying warm and fed. You had to keep your mind sharp and your spirit engaged, or the isolation would eat away at you from the inside. Diana set up the board on the small table between their chairs. You play? Some. Been a while, though. Good. I haven't had a real opponent in 2 years. They played their first game slowly, feeling out each other's style and strategy. Diana favored patient, defensive positioning, building careful protection around her pieces before committing to any aggressive moves. Gideon played with the methodical approach of someone who thought several moves ahead but wasn't afraid to take calculated risks. As they played, their conversation ranged over topics that felt safer than the personal revelations of the previous day. Diana shared her knowledge of the local plant life, describing which roots and berries were safe to eat, which herbs had medicinal properties, and how to identify the signs that indicated where to find fresh water even in the depths of winter. The indigenous people who lived here before the settlers arrived, they understood this land in ways most white folks never will, she said, moving her bishop to defend against Gideon's advancing rook. I found some of their old campsites up in the high meadows, places where they'd return year after year because they knew exactly what the land could provide in each season. You've explored the entire property, most of it. Took me the better part of my first summer to walk all the boundaries and understand the lay of the land. Diana captured one of his pawns with a move he hadn't seen coming. There are places up there that take your breath away, hidden valleys, where the wildflowers grow so thick in spring that you can smell them for miles. Creek beds lined with stones that look like precious gems when the water runs clear. Gideon found himself drawn into her descriptions, recognizing in them the deep connection to place that came from careful observation over time. She spoke about the mountains the way other people talked about beloved family members, with intimate knowledge of their moods and habits, their generous moments and their dangerous ones. You talk about this place like you love it, he observed. I suppose I do. It's the first place I've lived where I felt like I belonged rather than just passing through. Diana studied the chessboard, considering her next move. These mountains don't care about your past or your mistakes. They only care about whether you're smart enough and tough enough to earn your place among them, and you've earned your place. I've learned to read their signs and respect their power. I've found ways to take what I need without taking so much that I damage what provides for me. She moved her queen into a position that suddenly put Gideon's king in serious jeopardy. Check. He studied the board with new respect for her tactical abilities. You've been hustling me. I've been playing chess. You assumed I wouldn't be very good at it because I'm a woman living alone in the wilderness. Guilty. As charged, Gideon moved his king to safety but could see that Diana had gained a significant advantage. Your grandfather taught you well. He taught me that intelligence was the most important tool for survival, more valuable than strength or luck or even courage. He said a person who could think clearly and plan carefully could overcome almost any disadvantage. Smart man. He was. He's also the one who taught me about reading people, understanding their motivations, and whether they could be trusted. Diana's eyes met his across the chessboard. He said you could learn more about someone's character from playing chess with them than from a dozen conversations. And what has this game taught you about my character? That you're careful but not timid, that you think before you act, but you're not afraid to take reasonable risks, that you don't get angry when someone proves to be smarter than you expected them to be. Diana moved another piece, tightening her control over the center of the board. Also that you're the kind of man who plays to win, but doesn't cheat to get there. High praise from someone who's beating me soundly. The game's not over yet, but they both knew it soon would be. Diana had gained control of the board through patience and superior positioning, and Gideon could see no way to recover from his disadvantage. He played out the next several moves with good humor, trying different strategies to see if any might salvage the game. "Checkmate," Diana said finally, though her tone held no triumph, only satisfaction at a game well played. "Impressive. You've obviously had a lot of practice. 2 winters with nothing but books and chess problems to keep my mind occupied. I've played through every famous game I could find descriptions of, worked out problems and strategies, until I could see patterns in my sleep." Gideon began setting up the pieces for another game. "Your grandfather would be proud. I hope so. Everything I've accomplished here, I've tried to do in ways that would honor what he taught me about living with integrity and intelligence." As they began their second game, Gideon found himself thinking about the remarkable woman across from him. She'd taken the worst kind of abandonment and transformed it into an opportunity to build something meaningful. She'd faced isolation that would have broken many people and emerged stronger, more capable, more deeply connected to the world around her. "Diana," he said, as she opened with a move he didn't recognize, "what do you think about when you imagine your future?" Diana's question about the future hung between them as she considered her opening move. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful tone of someone who'd learned not to hope too openly for things that might be taken away. "I think about seasons, mostly. Whether I'll have enough firewood for next winter, whether the garden plot will produce enough vegetables to last through the cold months, whether the creek will run high enough in spring to fill my water barrels." She moved her knight with deliberate precision. "I've stopped thinking much beyond the practical necessities. That's survival thinking. I'm asking about something deeper than that." Diana raised her eyes from the chessboard to study his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean the things you dream about when you let yourself imagine that life might offer more than just getting through each day." Gideon moved his own piece and leaned back in his chair. "The things you want, not just the things you need." She was quiet for so long that he wondered if he'd pushed too hard, asked for more trust than their brief acquaintance had earned. But then she rose from her chair and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression he couldn't read. "I dream about having someone to share the work with," she said finally. "Someone who'd want to build something lasting instead of just passing through. I dream about planting fruit trees and knowing I'll still be here to harvest them when they mature. About having children who'd grow up understanding these mountains the way my grandfather understood the land where he was raised. Those sound like good dreams. They're foolish dreams for a woman in my position." Diana turned back toward him, her expression carefully controlled. "I have no family name to offer, no dowry, no connections to respectable society. I'm 24 years old, and I've been living alone in the wilderness like some kind of hermit. What man would want to build a future with someone like that? A man with sense enough to recognize what he'd found." The simple sincerity in his voice made Diana study his face with sharp attention. She'd learned to be wary of easy compliments and smooth words, but there was something in Gideon's weathered features that spoke of hard-won honesty rather than calculated charm. "You're being kind. I'm being truthful. You've created something remarkable here, Diana. You've taken a desperate situation and turned it into a life worth living. You've mastered skills that most people never learn. And you've done it all while maintaining your dignity and your principles." Gideon gestured toward the chess set, the well-organized cabin, the evidence of her careful stewardship. Any man worth having would see all of that and count himself lucky. Diana returned to her chair, but didn't immediately resume the game. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded cloth. When she unwrapped it, Gideon saw a simple wooden box, no larger than his palm, with intricate carving covering every surface. "My grandfather made this for my grandmother the year they were married," she said, running her fingers over the carved designs. Inside, he put letters he'd written to her during their courtship. Pressed flowers from their wedding bouquet, small treasures that marked important moments in their life together. She opened the box to reveal a collection of papers, dried flowers and small keepsakes that spoke of a love story spanning decades. The letters were tied with ribbon that had once been white, but had faded to cream with age. The flowers were brittle now, but had been preserved with obvious care. After they died, I found this hidden in their bedroom. I read the letters. I know I shouldn't have. But I was so lonely and missing them so much that I needed to understand what they'd meant to each other. Diana lifted one of the letters from the box and held it gently. He wrote to her about building a life together, about creating something that would last beyond their own lives, about love being more than just feeling, about it being a choice to keep building something beautiful, even when times were hard. They sound like wise people. They were. And reading those letters taught me something important about what I really want from life. Diana returned the letter to the box and closed the lid carefully. I don't want to just survive anymore, Gideon. I want to build something that matters, something that would make my grandfather proud of the woman I've become. What kind of something? A real homestead. Gardens and orchards and maybe some livestock. A place where I could use everything my grandparents taught me about living in harmony with the land. A place where children could grow up, learning to read the weather and identify edible plants and understand that the earth will provide for you if you treat it with respect. Gideon felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of possibility, of hope for a future that included more than just solitary survival. That sounds like a fine dream. It's more than a dream now. Diana opened the box again and withdrew a folded paper from beneath the letters. I've been working on plans for the property, thinking about how to develop it sustainably. Look, she unfolded the paper to reveal a detailed map of the area, drawn in careful pencil with notes and measurements covering every inch. Gideon could see proposed locations for expanded gardens, areas marked for potential orchards, sites identified for livestock shelters and food storage buildings. You drew this? Over the past year, as I learned more about the land and what it could support. See here? She pointed to an area near the creek. This would be perfect for a larger vegetable garden. The soil is rich, it gets good sun exposure, and it's close enough to the water source for easy irrigation. And this area? Gideon indicated a section she'd marked with different symbols, grazing land for goats or sheep. The grass is good there, and it's naturally fenced by those rock formations. We could... She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. I could manage a small herd there without much additional fencing. You said we... I misspoke. Did you? Gideon studied the map with growing amazement. This is incredible work, Diana. You've thought of everything: water management, soil conservation, seasonal planning. This isn't just a homestead plan, it's a sustainable land management strategy. I've had plenty of time to think and plan. Time and intelligence and vision. Gideon met her eyes. The question is whether you'll ever get the chance to implement any of it. Before Diana could respond, both of them heard something that made them freeze, the distant sound of horses approaching through the snow. Diana moved to the window with practiced silence, while Gideon reached for his grandfather's rifle. Through the glass, they could see 3 riders emerging from the tree line, their horses laboring through the deep snow that the storm had left behind. The men wore heavy coats and sat their saddles with the confident posture of people accustomed to getting their way in remote places. You expecting company? Gideon asked quietly. No one knows I'm here except... Diana's voice caught as she recognized the lead rider. Patterson, the man who lost me this property. And 2 men I don't recognize. Diana backed away from the window. They're armed, and they're not here for a social visit. Gideon checked his rifle's load while Diana gathered her few valuables and tucked them into hidden places around the cabin. Her movements were quick and efficient, speaking of someone who'd prepared for exactly this possibility. There's a root cellar with an outside entrance behind the cabin, she said. If things go badly, you can get out that way. I'm not running from 3 men on my own property. This stopped being about property rights the moment Patterson showed up with hired guns. Before Gideon could respond, a harsh voice called out from the yard. Hayes, we know you're in there. Come out and let's have a civilized conversation. Gideon moved to the door but didn't open it. State your business, Patterson. My business is correcting a mistake. That poker game was conducted under false pretenses, and I'm here to reclaim what's rightfully mine, the deed says. Otherwise, the deed don't mean nothing if the man who signed it didn't have legal authority to do. So, Patterson's voice carried the smugness of someone who believed he held all the advantages. See, that property was never mine to lose. I was just managing it for the real owners. Diana appeared at Gideon's shoulder, her face pale but determined. He's lying, she whispered. I've seen the territorial records. Patterson held clear title to this land for 3 years. Maybe so, Gideon murmured back, but lies can be dangerous when they're backed by guns. Hayes, Patterson called again. I've got a surveyor's map here that's going to interest you. Shows some mighty valuable mineral deposits on this land. The kind of deposits that mining companies pay real good money to access. Gideon felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. That's what this is about. Open the door, Hayes, and let's discuss this like civilized men. No need for anyone to get hurt over a simple misunderstanding. Instead of opening the door, Gideon moved to the side window where he could see the 3 men more clearly. Patterson sat his horse with the nervous energy of someone who'd invested too much in a risky scheme. The other 2 men looked like professional trouble, the kind of men who got paid to solve problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. Diana, Gideon said quietly, tell me about those territorial records you mentioned. I spent weeks in the territorial office last summer, copying down information about land grants and mineral rights in this area. Patterson's name appears on the deed transfer from 1899, when he bought the property from the previous owner for back taxes. And the mineral rights? Listed as separate from the surface rights. The original owner retained mineral claims when he sold to the territory, but those claims were never transferred to Patterson when he bought the surface rights. Gideon absorbed this information while watching the 3 men outside. So Patterson owns the surface, but not what's underneath. Owned, past tense. And only the surface rights transferred to you when you won the poker game. But if someone discovered valuable minerals on the property, they'd need to negotiate with whoever holds the mineral rights, not the surface owner. Diana's eyes widened as she understood the implications. Unless they could establish a fraudulent claim to the entire property. Hayes. Patterson's voice had taken on an edge of impatience. I'm trying to be reasonable here, but my associates are getting cold waiting out in this snow. Gideon made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of opening the door, he called back through the thick wood. Patterson, I've got some questions about those mineral rights you mentioned. Seems to me a man who's been managing property for other people might have some explaining to do about why he was gambling with deeds he didn't actually own. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Gideon to know he'd hit close to the mark. When Patterson finally responded, his voice carried a new tension. You don't understand the situation, Hayes. I understand it better than you think. I understand that you've been running some kind of confidence game, using forged documents to claim property that doesn't belong to you. I understand that you probably have mining company investors who've paid good money for access to mineral deposits they think you can deliver. And I understand, Diana added loudly enough for the men outside to hear, that the real mineral rights holder is someone Patterson has been trying to cheat out of their legitimate claims. You're wrong about that, girl. But Patterson's voice had lost its confident edge. Diana moved to her wooden crate and retrieved a leather portfolio that Gideon hadn't seen before. Inside were dozens of hand-copied documents, maps, and correspondence that spoke of months of careful research. The mineral rights to this property, she said, reading from one of the documents, were retained by Marcus Blackthorne when he sold the surface rights to the territory in 1897. Upon Blackthorne's death in 1903, those rights passed to his only surviving heir, his daughter, Margaret Blackthorne Chen. Gideon felt the world shift around him as he understood what Diana was telling him. Chen, like your brother's name, Margaret Blackthorne. Chen was my grandmother. She married my grandfather and took his name, but she never sold her mineral rights to this property. Diana's voice grew stronger as she continued. When she died, those rights passed to my mother. When my mother died, they passed to my brother Thomas. And when Thomas disappeared, they passed to you. Hayes, Patterson's voice had turned angry. Stop listening to that girl's lies and come out here. We can settle this like reasonable men. Gideon looked at Diana with new understanding. You've known all along that you had legal claim to this land, not to the surface rights. Those belonged to Patterson, and now they belong to you. But the mineral rights, she held up another document. I have my grandmother's original deed, my parents' death certificates, and Thomas's military records establishing the chain of inheritance. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I wasn't sure I could trust you. And because I knew that the moment anyone learned about the mineral rights, this place would stop being a refuge and become a target. Outside, they could hear the men dismounting and moving closer to the cabin. Patterson's voice had taken on the tone of someone whose patience had run out. Hayes, I'm giving you one more chance to be reasonable. Come out now, and we can discuss compensation for your inconvenience. Stay in there, and my associates will have to solve this problem in ways none of us will enjoy. Gideon checked his rifle again and looked at Diana. Do you have proof of your mineral rights claim? Everything's documented and witnessed. I even have correspondence from a territorial judge confirming the inheritance chain. Diana gathered the papers and tucked them into her coat. But legal documents don't mean much when you're facing men with guns. No, Gideon agreed. They don't. But they mean everything when it comes to what happens after we deal with the men with guns. The sound of boots on the cabin's front steps told them both that their time for planning had run out. Whatever happened next would determine not just who controlled the property, but whether either of them lived to see another day. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, but Gideon could hear the men positioning themselves around the cabin. Professional killers didn't announce their intentions. They created tactical advantages and eliminated escape routes before making their move. Diana, he said quietly, where exactly is that root cellar entrance? Northwest corner behind the woodpile. But I'm not leaving you to face them alone. You're not leaving me. You're protecting the evidence that proves your legal claim to this property. Gideon moved to his saddlebags and withdrew a wooden box he'd kept wrapped in oiled leather. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay his grandfather's service revolver and the military decoration that had accompanied it home from Cuba. Diana stared at the pistol as Gideon checked its cylinder with practiced efficiency. You never mentioned you were career military. I wasn't. But some lessons stick with you longer than others. He tucked the revolver into his belt and lifted his grandfather's rifle. Its familiar weight, bringing back memories of training and conflict he'd tried to leave behind. My grandfather didn't just hunt deer with this rifle, Diana. He used it to defend his family when defending was necessary. Patterson. The voice came from a new position, somewhere near the cabin's east wall. We're done being patient. You've got 30 seconds to open that door or we're coming in. Gideon moved to the window and caught sight of movement among the trees. There are more than 3 of them. How many more? Can't tell for certain, but I count at least 5, maybe 6. He studied the terrain around the cabin, noting sightlines and potential cover. They've got us surrounded, but they don't know the land the way you do. What are you thinking? I'm thinking they expect us to either surrender or hole up in here like trapped animals. They're not expecting a fighting retreat through terrain that favors someone who knows every tree and boulder. Gideon looked at Diana directly. But that only works if one of us creates a distraction while the other escapes with the evidence. And you're volunteering to be the distraction. I'm volunteering to be the one who stays and fights while you get those documents to someone who can enforce your legal rights. Diana was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a new determination. There's another option. What kind of option? She moved to the fireplace and reached up into the chimney, withdrawing a leather satchel that had been hidden above the flue. Inside were items that made Gideon reassess everything he thought he knew about Diana's time alone in the mountains. carefully wrapped bundles of what looked like mining explosives, coils of fuse wire, and detailed maps showing the location of every tunnel and shaft in the old silver mine. Where did you get dynamite? From the mine itself. The previous owners left cases of it in the lower tunnels, probably figuring it was too dangerous to transport when they shut down operations. Diana began checking the condition of the explosive charges with surprising expertise. I've spent 2 years learning every inch of those tunnels, mapping every passage, and understanding exactly how they connect to the surface. You're talking about bringing down the mine. I'm talking about removing the thing they came here to steal. No accessible mine, no mineral extraction, no reason for Patterson's investors to keep funding his operation. Diana's hands moved with steady precision as she prepared the charges. And I'm talking about creating enough noise and confusion to give us both a fighting chance. That's incredibly dangerous. So is facing 6 armed men with nothing but a rifle and a prayer. Diana stood and shouldered the satchel. The main tunnel entrance is about 200 yards up the ridge. If I can reach it without being seen, I can set charges that will collapse the primary access shaft and most of the connecting passages. And if they catch you before you reach the mine, then you'll hear gunshots and you'll know to implement whatever backup plan you're working on. Gideon studied her face, seeing in it the same calm determination that had allowed her to survive 2 years alone in this harsh country. She wasn't proposing this course of action out of desperation. She was thinking tactically, using every advantage available to them. How long would you need? 20 minutes to reach the mine, 10 minutes to set the charges, another 20 to get back here or reach the alternate escape route through the North Ravine. That's 50 minutes total. I need to keep them occupied and in position for almost an hour. Can you do that? Gideon thought about the men outside, their positioning, their obvious confidence in their numerical advantage. I can make them believe we're both trapped in here for that long. But once those charges go off, they're going to know something's changed. By then, it won't matter. The mine will be sealed, the mineral rights will be worthless for extraction purposes, and Patterson's scheme will be finished. Assuming we both survive the next hour, Diana moved to her coat and withdrew the small leather pouch containing her brother's military tags. She held them for a moment, then placed them carefully on the table beside the chess set. Thomas spent his whole life running from fights he couldn't win. I'm not going to make the same mistake. She met Gideon's eyes. These mountains gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. I'm not letting anyone steal that from me. Diana, time to go. She moved toward the back of the cabin, then paused. Gideon, if something happens to me, promise me you'll make sure the real story gets told. Promise me Patterson and his people won't get away with this. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me anyway. I promise. But I'm making you promise something too. Gideon stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Promise me you'll be careful up there. Promise me you'll come back. I promise. For a moment they stood facing each other, 2 people who'd found something precious and unexpected in the midst of danger and uncertainty. Then Diana reached up and touched his cheek gently. When this is over, she said, we're going to have a conversation about building something that lasts. When this is over, Gideon agreed, we're going to have a lot of conversations. She smiled then, the first truly happy expression he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. Then she was moving toward the back door, her steps silent and purposeful. Hayes! Patterson's voice carried new anger. Your time's up. Open the door now, or we're coming in shooting. Gideon positioned himself near the front window and called back. You want to discuss this, Patterson? Then tell your hired guns to back off, and we'll talk like civilized men. You're in no position to make demands. I'm in a position to make your life very complicated. See, I've been looking at some interesting documents about mineral rights and inheritance laws. Turns out your claim to this property isn't as solid as you've been telling your investors. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that Diana Chen is the legal heir to the mineral rights you've been trying to steal. I know that you've been running a confidence game with forged documents and false claims. And I know that when the territorial authorities find out what you've been doing, you're going to spend a long time in federal prison. The silence that followed told Gideon that his words had hit their mark. Through the window he could see movement as the men adjusted their positions, clearly preparing for a direct assault on the cabin. But Diana would have had enough time to reach the tree line by now, and with luck, she was already climbing toward the mine entrance. All Gideon had to do was keep Patterson's attention, focused on the cabin for another 40 minutes. He checked his grandfather's rifle one more time and settled into position behind the heavy wooden table that Diana had used for chess and meal preparation. In a few minutes, this peaceful room would become a battlefield, and everything they'd built together over the past few days would be put to the ultimate test. Outside, he could hear Patterson giving orders to his men, positioning them for what would either be the end of Diana's homestead dreams or the beginning of something even more remarkable than either of them had dared to imagine. The first shot splintered the cabin door just as Gideon dropped behind the overturned table. Wood fragments showered the room, and he could hear Patterson shouting orders to his men as they began their assault. Through the chaos, one thought dominated his mind. Diana needed 30 more minutes to reach the mine and set her charges. Hayes. Patterson's voice carried over the gunfire. "This ends now. Send out the girl, and we might let you walk away from this," Gideon answered with a carefully aimed shot through the front window, shattering glass and sending one of Patterson's men diving for cover behind the woodpile. The return volley punched holes through the cabin's log walls, but the thick timber construction absorbed most of the damage. 28 minutes left. He moved to a new position, using the stone fireplace as cover while scanning for targets. Through the back window, he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees, Diana's dark coat barely visible as she climbed toward the ridge. She was making good time, but the men outside would spot her if any of them circled around to the cabin's rear. "You're fighting a losing battle, Hayes," Patterson called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "My people have been doing this kind of work for years. You're just one man with an old hunting rifle. Your people picked the wrong man to threaten," Gideon replied, then shifted position again as bullets chewed through the wall where he'd been crouched. Through the front window, he could see at least 3 muzzle flashes from different positions. The attackers were being professional about it, laying down covering fire while others moved to better positions, trying to flank the cabin from multiple angles. But their very professionalism worked against them in this situation. They were being careful, methodical, which meant they were moving slowly. 25 minutes left. A shadow passed by the east window, and Gideon put a shot through the glass that sent the man scrambling back toward the trees. The movement gave him a better count of their numbers. Definitely 6 men, maybe 7. Positioned in a rough semicircle around the cabin's front and sides. "Hayes, you're bleeding us all for nothing." Patterson's voice had taken on a note of genuine frustration. "The girl's inheritance claim won't hold up in territorial court. We've got lawyers, connections, money to fight this through proper channels. You're dying for a piece of paper that won't be worth anything when we're done with it." Gideon used the time Patterson spent talking to reload his rifle and check his remaining ammunition. He had perhaps 20 rounds left, enough for another 10 minutes of sustained fighting if he was careful with his shots. "Tell me something, Patterson," he called back. "How many investors did you bilk with your fake mineral rights scheme? How much money did you take from people who trusted you to deliver mining claims you never actually owned? You don't understand the business realities of territorial development." "I understand fraud when I see it." Another shot from Gideon's rifle sent bark flying from a tree where one of the hired guns had been taking aim. "I understand that you've been selling claims to mineral deposits that belong to someone else." 21 minutes left. The attack intensified as Patterson's patience finally ran out. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides simultaneously, forcing Gideon to stay low behind the fireplace, while bullets shattered everything breakable in the cabin. Diana's carefully organized home was being systematically destroyed, but the stone and timber construction held firm against the assault. During a brief pause while the attackers reloaded, Gideon heard something that made his heart race, the distant sound of riders approaching from the south. More of Patterson's men, or possibly help arriving from an unexpected source. "Boss," one of the hired guns called out. "We got company coming up the valley." Through the gunfire and shouting, Gideon caught fragments of urgent conversation among the attackers. Someone was approaching fast, and from Patterson's tone, it wasn't part of his original plan. That 18 minutes left. The new arrivals announced themselves with a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of federal law. "Enforcement, this is Deputy U.S. Marshal William Brooks. You men around that cabin need to throw down your weapons and step into the open with your hands visible." Gideon felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. How had a federal marshal found his way to this remote valley in the middle of a blizzard? But the answer mattered less than the opportunity it presented. "Marshal Brooks," Gideon called out. "This is Gideon Hayes, the legal owner of this property. These men are trying to steal mineral rights through fraud and violence." "Hayes, stay where you are." "Patterson, I've got federal warrants for you and your associates. This ends now." The gunfire stopped abruptly as Patterson's men found themselves caught between a defended cabin and federal law enforcement. In the sudden quiet, Gideon could hear urgent whispered conferences among the attackers as they tried to decide whether to fight, flee, or surrender. 15 minutes left until Diana's charges would seal the mine forever if she'd made it that far safely. But now, with federal marshals on the scene, the situation had become far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Marshal Brooks rode into the clearing with 3 deputies, their badges gleaming even in the overcast light. Patterson's men found themselves caught in an impossible position, federal law enforcement blocking their retreat while Gideon held the cabin against their advance. "Patterson," Brooks called out, "I've been tracking you for 6 months, following a trail of fraudulent mining claims and forged documents across 3 territories. It ends here." From his position behind the fireplace, Gideon could see Patterson's face through the window. The man's confident swagger had evaporated, replaced by the desperate calculation of someone whose elaborate scheme was collapsing around him. "Marshal, there's been a misunderstanding," Patterson called back, his voice taking on the smooth tone of a practiced liar. "These people are squatting on legally purchased property. We're here to enforce legitimate property rights. The only legitimate property rights involved here belong to Diana Chen," Gideon shouted. "Patterson's been running a confidence game, selling mineral extraction rights he never owned to investors across the territory." Brooks dismounted and moved closer, his rifle trained on the trees where Patterson's men had taken cover. "Hayes, you mentioned Diana Chen. Where is she?" Gideon checked his pocket watch. 7 minutes until Diana's planned detonation. "She's securing evidence that proves her legal claim to the mineral rights on this property." "Securing evidence where?" Before Gideon could answer, the sound of distant gunfire echoed from the direction of the mine. "Diana had been discovered, Marshal," one of Patterson's men called out. "There's someone up at the old mine shaft." Gideon's blood went cold. If they'd caught Diana before she could set the charges, everything they'd fought for would be lost. He made a decision that would either save her or get them both killed. "Cover me," he shouted to Brooks, then burst through the cabin's back door. The terrain between the cabin and the mine was a nightmare of snow-covered rocks and fallen timber, but Gideon knew Diana's planned route from her careful descriptions. He could hear shouts behind him as Patterson's men tried to decide whether to pursue him or deal with the federal marshals. But his focus was entirely on reaching Diana before it was too late. The gunfire from the mine had stopped, which could mean anything. Gideon climbed as fast as the deep snow allowed, his grandfather's rifle clutched in his hands and his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her crouched behind a boulder 50 yards from the mine entrance, her coat torn and blood seeping from a graze across her left shoulder. But her hands were steady as she worked with the fuse wire, and her eyes blazed with fierce determination. "Diana!" "Gideon, what are you doing here?" "Heard shooting. Thought you were in trouble." "I was. 2 of Patterson's men followed me up here. I managed to lose them in the mine tunnels, but they know where I am now." She held up the prepared charges. The explosives are set, but I need 3 more minutes to run the fuse wire to a safe distance. Where are Patterson's men now? Inside the mine, trying to find where I place the charges so they can disarm them. Gideon studied the mine entrance, a dark opening in the mountainside supported by heavy timber beams. If Diana's charges brought down the main tunnel, anyone inside would be trapped. Diana, there are federal marshals down at the cabin. This has become a legal matter, not just a shooting war. Legal matters won't mean anything if Patterson's people find those charges and remove them. The mine has to be sealed, Gideon. It's the only way to end this permanently, but if those men are still inside... Then they made their choice, when they decided to chase me into an unstable mine shaft during a demolition operation. Diana's voice carried no malice, only the hard pragmatism of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required terrible decisions. A shout from the mine entrance told them both that Patterson's men had found at least some of the charges. Diana's face went pale as she realized they were out of time. "Go," she said, pressing the fuse lighter into Gideon's hands. "Light the fuse and get down the mountain. Tell Marshal Brooks what happened here. I'm not leaving you, and I'm not letting Patterson steal what my family built." Diana rose from behind the boulder, her rifle ready. "Those men in the mine, they're not going to let me walk away from this. But they might hesitate to shoot if they think it could bring down the tunnel on all of us." Before Gideon could stop her, she was moving toward the mine entrance, calling out to the men inside. "This is Diana Chen. I've got 20 pounds of dynamite wired throughout these tunnels. You have 30 seconds to come out with your hands up, or I'm bringing down this entire mountain." The echo of her voice disappeared into the mine's depths, followed by an ominous silence that seemed to stretch forever. In the distance, Gideon could hear more gunfire from the cabin, where Marshal Brooks was still dealing with the remainder of Patterson's gang. Diana looked back at him one last time, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for. Spring arrived at Blackwater Ridge like a gentle promise kept after a long, hard winter. Diana stood in her garden plot, her hands deep in the rich soil, as she planted the first seeds of what would become a remarkable homestead. The packets of garden seeds in her apron represented more than just vegetables. They symbolized hope, growth, and the cultivation of a shared future. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the mine, and the valley had settled into a peace that felt both earned and lasting. The explosive charges had never been detonated. When faced with Diana's ultimatum, Patterson's men had emerged from the mine with their hands raised, choosing surrender over the possibility of being buried alive in unstable tunnels. Marshal Brooks had arrested Patterson and his entire crew on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and assault. The investigation that followed revealed a network of fake mineral rights claims stretching across 4 territories, with Patterson as the central figure in a scheme that had bilked investors out of thousands of dollars. "The territorial judge was impressed with your documentation," Gideon said, walking up from the cabin with 2 cups of coffee. "Said he'd never seen a more thorough inheritance claim in all his years on the bench." Diana accepted the coffee gratefully and straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "My grandfather always said that proper records were a person's best protection against those who'd try to cheat them. I just never imagined I'd need that protection so desperately." The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Diana's claim to the mineral rights was upheld without question, and the territorial court had ruled that her ownership extended to reasonable surface usage for homesteading purposes. Gideon's surface rights from the poker game remained valid, creating a unique partnership that had surprised even the lawyers involved. "Any word from the mining company investors?" Diana asked. "Brooks says most of them are just relieved to recover any portion of their money through Patterson's seized assets. None of them have any interest in pursuing mineral extraction claims against the rightful owner." "Good. That means we can focus on building something sustainable. Instead of fighting off treasure hunters," they walked together toward the creek. where Gideon had been working on an irrigation system that would support Diana's expanded garden plans. The sound of running water mixed with birdsong created a symphony that spoke of renewal and possibility. "The fruit trees arrived yesterday," Gideon said, gesturing toward a collection of young saplings waiting to be planted. "Apple, pear, and cherry, just like you wanted. The man in town said they're good mountain varieties that should thrive at this elevation. We'll plant them tomorrow. I want to make sure the locations are perfect. Somewhere they'll have room to grow for the next 50 years. 50 years. Diana spoke about the future with a confidence that would have been impossible during those desperate winter months when she'd lived alone, never knowing if each day might be her last in this place. Now she talked about decades of growth and development as if they were certainties rather than hopes. "Diana," Gideon said, stopping beside the creek, where the water ran clear over smooth stones, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." She turned to face him, her dark eyes warm, with the kind of trust that had grown slowly between them through shared hardship and mutual respect. "What kind of something?" "The kind of something that involves making this partnership permanent." Gideon reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, carved with the same intricate patterns that decorated Diana's grandmother's treasure box. "I've been working on this since the legal issues were settled." Diana opened the box to reveal a ring carved from a single piece of mountain ash, its surface polished to a warm golden glow. Inlaid around the band were tiny chips of silver ore from the sealed mine, transformed from symbols of greed and conflict into tokens of beauty and commitment. "Gideon," she whispered, her voice catching with emotion, "I know we've only known each other a few months, but they've been months that taught me more about living than I learned in the previous 30 years. Gideon took her hands in his, noting the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had carried her through impossible circumstances. "You showed me what it means to build something lasting, something that honors the land instead of exploiting it. And you showed me what it means to have a partner instead of just surviving alone. So I'm asking if you'd be willing to make this official, to build a real homestead together, raise children who understand these mountains the way your grandfather understood the land where he was raised, to create something that would make all our family members proud of what we've accomplished." Diana's answer came not in words, but in the way she stepped closer and kissed him with the passion of someone who'd finally found home in another person's heart. When they separated, her eyes were bright with tears of joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." They spent the rest of the morning planting fruit trees in carefully chosen spots around the property, each one positioned with the long view in mind. The young saplings looked fragile in the vastness of the mountain landscape, but Diana and Gideon both understood that the most important things grew slowly, with patient tending and unwavering commitment. As the sun reached its zenith, they stood together on the cabin's front porch, looking out over land that now belonged to both of them in ways that went far beyond legal documents. The homestead plans Diana had drawn during those long winter nights were taking shape in reality, with gardens and orchards and livestock areas that would provide abundance for generations to come. "Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it," Diana said, echoing the words that had begun their story. "And sometimes," Gideon replied, "that second chance turns out to be better than anything you originally dared to hope for." In the distance, the sealed mine reminded them of battles fought and won, but their focus was entirely on the future they would build together, a future rooted in love, sustained by hard work, and blessed with the kind of peace that comes only to those who've earned it through surviving their worst trials and choosing to trust again.